Mariagrazia Squicciarini is interviewed for the ESCoE conference on Economic Measurement 2020 by conference co-chair Anna Galvão.
So, Mariagrazia, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Okay.
Very glad to be with you.
Oh, great. So my first question is the following. So you were in a session in the conference that was about how one can use online vacancy jobs adverts to measure some characteristics of the labor market. So my first question is, is it useful? I mean, because traditionally the statistical office, they use surveys to measure characteristics of the labor market, to measure employment, to measure, to figure out people across occupations. So my question is there big advantages in using online data? Or disadvantages as well?
Well, I think there are both. And I don't think we can use online job posting data as substitute for National Statistical Office's type of surveys. And there are several reasons. First of all, of course, one of the key advantages, among the key advantages of this data, we have the timeliness. So we can get today, for instance, the data about September already. We have, of course, ease of access. So we don't need to go to the premises of, say, the National Statistical Office to access the micro level data or link these data to other data. So there is an access type of advantage. And also in our case, and this is very much a characteristic of the OECD, we normally do cross-country analysis, which means we need to access several countries' data at the same time. And of course, online job postings allowed us to do so. There is also something like the wealth of information that are provided. So for instance, something that normally we wouldn't get from surveys is the kind of firms posting the job and even the name of the firm. And this, of course, leads us to the possibility to link to other data sets. The details provided, so the type of task to be carried out or the skills demanded. And I think also importantly, another advantage is the fact that we don't have data preset by occupation, which means that we can investigate how occupations themselves are changing. And we don't need to carry out analysis or incorporate data that are preset or pre-given or synthesized at the level of certain occupational categories. Now, of course, this comes at a cost. So the first one is really the monetary cost of purchasing this data.
The fact that,
sorry?
The data is for sale, I see.
Yeah, the data cost money. Mm-hmm. So one has to have the budget to buy them. But then there is no such a thing as universal coverage. So even if it's true, using certain data sets, we can access more than one country. In order to, for instance, to cover all our member countries, we need to purchase several data sets because none of them covers them all. There is, more importantly, for our purposes, also a problem of representativeness at the occupational level. So here we have to make perhaps a bit of an excursus, that is, not all sector, not all occupation, not all workers are digitalized to the same extent. And of course, in order to post jobs online, there has to be a certain eagerness, availability, ability from companies and industries to do that. And on the other hand, workers looking for online job posting have to have a certain ability to use these devices. So we do see, and we have done a study where we have checked the representativeness at the occupational level, that of course there are some occupational categories that are much better represented than others. For instance, elementary occupations, which at times even are looked for, you look for workers, even simply putting a note on the door of a shop, for instance. And then, let's say, very often and again, this is perhaps a prerequisite of the OECD, like, we really need to understand the structural characteristics of this data, because then we are going to draw policy implications. And we see that very often these data lack of good metadata, like instead we normally get from national statistical offices, which allow us to understand and then control for instance, in analysis better for the possible drawbacks of this data.
I see. So you have a better picture of all the information you need to understand what's in the data. Oh, this is all very interesting. Let me move on now to the research you're presenting at the conference that was about AI related jobs. So using this online data that you just discussed now to try to measure this. My question is, why is this interesting questions? Why we're interested in looking at AI related job, and then how useful was in this case to use the data you just mentioned?
Well, in the case of the OECD, our work was really pushed by the importance that AI in general has been having on the agenda of policymakers. We see a lot of funding everywhere in the world being channeled towards AI-related activities, and we have seen in the last months, for instance, a lot of international collaboration in the AI space. Now, the question is that if, as governments, firms, sectors seem to think that AI is the next technological trajectory or even the next technological paradigm, we know that technological development and adoption is not going to happen and cannot happen without the necessary human capital. Hence, the question for us becomes how to identify and characterize AI-related human capital demanded, and not only being able also to distinguish the capital that is aiming at developing further the technology itself, so the core AI developers, as compared to the kind of occupational profiles, the kind of jobs, the kind of tasks that actually relate to for instance, adoption of AI-related devices or components in the functioning of a firm or in the construction of a certain product or process. So in our case, it's important for policymakers. We know there is a lot of efforts from country to support development and adoption of AI, but then it becomes very difficult, first of all, as there is no agreement on even a definition of what AI is, an internationally agreed definition, and let alone on jobs related to AI. Now, using online job platform allows us to do two things: to have details that we might not and generally do not get from general surveys, and again, the timeliness. The other thing, which I mentioned also before, is really to look without taking into account ex ante the occupational profile, but really look at what these workers that are sought after by companies are supposed to do. So looking really at the task. So it gives us really a lot of information that we would not be able to get from the traditional channels.
Okay, and how you read this data? So we've been talking about getting this data from data providers, and I'm thinking about these online advertisers. We're looking for someone with these characteristics. How you read it? Which kind of techniques do you use?
Well, we start from the very general type of statistics, like consolidating at the industry, the firm level, the occupational level, the skill type level. But then, of course, I mean, we are enjoying ourselves, and I mean, I have a fantastic team there that does from keyword searches to text mining to semantic analysis, and we're also applying machine learning on data to understand what is AI related and what is not AI related, and to distinguish core AI jobs from non-core AI jobs. Another thing we are doing as well is network analysis, because the question there becomes to try and understand and look into the skill bundles and to understand how we can indicate, for instance, to countries which are the core skills that then enable the acquisition of corollary type of skills, as compared to skills that seemingly are very specific to one single company or to one single sector, which of course are less than the object of general policies, but are more related to sector-specific policies. So this is what we are doing with this data.
I see. Some characteristics of this data, as you told us before, is that you can look at analysis across countries, and I remember you did some analysis over time as well. So you could see which kind of skills AI related jobs are asking depending on the country or depending on the point in time. Can you tell me a bit more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the analysis we did, we were able, for the moment at least, to do the analysis on 4 countries only, because, for instance, 2 of the data supplier we were using, by the time we assessed their robustness, we understood that they were not up to the task because of issues in the representation of certain occupational categories. So what we do see is that even in a relatively short period, that is 2012, 2018, there has been an important change in the demand of the type of skills that are required in relation to AI. So one first thing we see very clearly is that over time, in the job ads that mentioned AI-related keywords or topics, we see that it's a progressive increase in the number of AI-related topics, keywords, or devices that are mentioned. So it's like they become more intensive in the AI component.
The job description gets longer with, is that what you mean? Or?
No, the job description more or less remains of the same dimension, and that very much depends on the type of platform they are using, because they gather data from several platforms and even from companies themselves. But what I mean here is that in the very same description, for instance, 100 words, if before, in 2012, most of the jobs related to AI mentioned 3 or 4 keywords related to AI, in 2018, we see that it's much more common to have 9 or 10 over the same 100.
I see. So it's more detailed somehow.
Absolutely. It's more detailed and perhaps to some extent, depending on the keywords they mention, even more broad. It's like there is an embedded flexibility that is sought after in these workers. And so it's like there are several concepts that are mentioned in the job posting that are related to AI. Another thing that emerges very, very clearly is that there seems to be a convergence towards using certain platform or certain, type of software or languages to compute AI-related developments. And this software-related component gets more and more important over time, to the point that in 2018 gets at about 30% of the AI-related keywords we find in the job ads. And to me, at least, the very kind of surprising, to some extent, finding that we have, that has emerged from the analysis, is the concept of bundle of skills being really thrown at us from the data, like, screaming bundles of skills. That is, in the past, very often, we saw job posting related to AI that were mainly related to, between brackets, geeks. So were people that were very specialized in the software, in the algorithm.
Write code and...
Exactly.
Code
so
they kind of job.
Exactly. So the IT specialist, as they used to be called, although in this case, even more specialized towards AI. What we see very, very clearly in 2018 is the relative importance of social-emotional skills that increases. That is, like, in addition to the very technical skills that seemingly get more and more demanded in these job openings overall, right? Again, given 100, the overall content, skills like project management, as well as communication or teamwork, gets more and more present. That is, not only you need to be able and be a competent IT specialist specialized in AI, what we need from you is that you manage a project, you know how to deal with it, you communicate, and you're able to work in team. And this, of course, to some extent, may also be, for instance, a consequence of these companies being located in several parts in the world, or trying to tap in, the skills bundles or the human capital repository of different locations worldwide. Of course, this is even more the case nowadays, because we do see that those jobs that have continued to be performed almost without interruption were those that were more teleworkable, so to speak. That is, things that can be performed at a distance through a computer. So it might signal several things, and we are now trying to investigate better also how these skills related to each other, because that will give us very important information for policymakers of what really is key that we provide people with, and what is something that, is a corollary and that specific company will endow their workers with by the time they enter the job.
It looks at the people working in artificial intelligence are more linked to the main business of the company they're working with, right? So if they need to have teamwork, is because probably they need to work with people that are not necessarily doing the same thing as they do. And before, I guess they used to be isolated in a corner coding, and now they are more integrated. That's something I was thinking when you were talking about. I found this very interesting, which means that maybe the jobs are becoming more mainstream as well, right? Which is one more reason why policymakers should think about I guess, providing training and education to develop these kind of skills. The other skills, the more specific ones you told us before, right? The skills related to a specific programming language, for example, yeah. Which I guess will be something that would help people get a job in AI nowadays, I guess. No?
Yeah, actually, to me, sincerely, Anna, it rings a bell also in relation to what was the chances, what was the likelihood that 30 years ago, any worker would be asked to speak another foreign language. Okay, and what is chances that they are asked now to speak, for instance, English? So it's like it's not something that is considered like a plus. It's kind of, you know, a normal requirement type of, if you really want to compete and if you really want to get a job in this kind of occupations, of course. So it's the parallel is the same with, I think, AI and social emotional skills. But indeed, I mean, I agree with you. It sends a very important signal to education and training type of policies that is like endow, find a way to revise curricula without making them lengthier, because we know we cannot add more. The curricula are already overloaded, but perhaps think of methodological approaches or pedagogical approaches so that you can endow people with the skills, the social emotional skills needed to go as a complement to the hard skills, the core STEM type of skills. And this is very different from what we observe at the beginning of the period.
No, this is very interesting. You know, I work for a business school. So in a business school, we encourage the students to do group work. And it's true, there is a type of students, probably the ones that are more technical, that dislike that a lot. In the beginning, they think, you know, they're the only ones that are going to do the job. The other people in their team are not going to do anything. And of course, we force them to do it because we know what you just, I mean, because it would help in the situation you just explained to us, right? That even in the way, you know, you might be learning how to code, but if you learn in a group, or if you have to present your code to someone that doesn't understand anything about AI, as part of your training, I guess you try to develop the kind of skills you just mentioned. And it's interesting you're able to identify that on the jobs, which means that the employers are very worried about, and they don't want, I guess, employees that arrive there and just say, oh, I just finished my code, it's done, I'm gonna go home now. If the code doesn't work, it's because, you know, it cannot be wrong, you know, that kind of thing. So tell me more about, so, you know, the kind of results you present in the conference. They use data until 2018. Have you had an opportunity to look at the more recent data, you know, if there is any impact already of the, you know, the lockdown or you know, people now are working from home, if there is any change on the demand for AI jobs?
Well, actually, you will need to, you know, ask me in a couple of months, because we are working at that. But actually, we are doing some different analysis using still this data, but until September. So every end of the month, we ask for the data for the previous month. And with colleagues from King's College London and the economic department at the OECD, we are now performing analysis that really looks at resilience in time of a high uncertainty, because let's face it, unfortunately, the crisis is still ongoing. And especially whether and to what extent we see some reallocation type of dynamics emerging. Okay, for the moment, this analysis is done only on the UK. For a number of reasons, but mainly because it's experimental. And what we already see, and it's really impressive to see, because we know there have been a lot of measures that were put in place in order to avoid mass layoffs and the like, we see that the lockdown as well as the furlough schemes are impacting sectors and occupations differently, and especially occupation in a different way. And it clearly emerges that it's really the middle skilled jobs that are the most affected, because almost all of them, with the exception of the high skill jobs, decreased during, the peak between when the lockdown was announced and when it was partially relieved, because if I understand correctly, in the UK, there was never an official announcement about the end of the lockdown, but on 4th of July, anyway, pubs and restaurants reopened. So it was a bit
So
of
it
an
was a
opening.
kind of signal, yeah.
Yeah, and we see that at the peak of the crisis in between April and May, all of these occupations, so low to middle skills and high skills, had decreased between 50 and 60%. So minus 50% in demand, so in job posting really, which is not exactly the same thing as demand. I'm perfectly aware of that. But let's say in the job posting, we see a reduction in the postings by 50% of high-skilled workers and by 60% of middle and low skills. But then by the time there is a partial reopening, high skill and low skill do pick up much better than middle skills job for which posting remain very sluggish. So there is really evidence about this, the middle category being hurted perhaps most than others, but it's very, very heterogeneous across sectors. I mean, it's interesting to see that despite the uncertainty and despite measures being mostly general throughout the economy, the reactions have been completely different, and firms are factoring in expectations in a completely different way.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that So remember, we started this interview talking about how these new type of data sets can help us understand what's going on in the labor market, and you just give us some additional example on how this can be done, right? Which is this change in the kind of occupation being demanded by employers in the UK. It's very interesting, Mariagrazia.
Thank you, Anna.
I think we're gonna finish this interview. If you're happy with, there's anything else you want to say, or?
No, I mean, really, thanks a lot for this opportunity. And I mean, I really think with these data, it's a matter of, before using them, getting to know which type of element we have in our hands. Because unfortunately, what I see, and this is really a word of caution to those entering into using new data. I mean, I'm responsible for the OECD Science, Technology and Innovation Microdata Lab, which puts together a number of different micro-level data. And every time we get new sources of information, we get new data sets, open or commercial, it doesn't really matter. I think it is fundamental to understand the representativeness of this data and the characteristics, because otherwise the conclusions that are drawn based on these new data may either risk to over-assess their potential, or may, lead to conclusions that do not have a solid evidence in the back. And in our case, I mean, we deal with policymakers. We try to give them evidence in support of what their decisions are. It may be very, very dangerous, because then distortive policies might be even worse than no policy whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this interview.
Thanks a lot for having me. Bye, Anna. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.